To quick introduce myself, I'm a senior Drupal consultant at Commerce Guys. I'm also a co-maintainer of Drupal Commerce. For those not familiar with Drupal Commerce, it is the leading e-commerce framework on top of the Drupal content management system. And I'm also the author of the Drupal 8 Development Cookbook, which came out earlier in March. That covers the new version of Drupal, which rolled out this year. Yeah, that's a bit about me. So let's talk about performance-driven development. There's some major, the idea of development is kind of like test-driven development, but you want to put performance first, or at least alongside your tests. You want to define your performance constraints. And defining a performance constraint would be, I want all my product pages to load in 1 second, or the catalog should take only a half second to render. And then the next step is to document what your existing performance constraints are against what your goals are. This can be done with Blackfire by writing tests, which we'll cover later in the webinar. And then you want to guard that performance. You don't want performance creep to slowly bloat your system. You want to ensure that you build a more performant application and not one that begins to slow down over time. And then finally, you want to improve. So instead of just keeping it at an even level, you want to eventually make it more performant and make it faster. So the key here is that you want to develop with performance as a feature. So performance features are essentially the benefits from implementing your design constraints. And as an example of that, e-commerce is built on web applications. The modern web isn't just a static website, it is a living application. And we designed these applications with features, with all the flash and the glimmer of, we need it to do this and do that. But we don't design constraints. We don't say what it has to live within in order to achieve those features. With my degree in software engineering, half of that school time was spent talking about performance constraints and other constraints. And that lives very heavily in the desktop development area. But as soon as we move to web development, it seems that performance constraints kind of go out the window. And this isn't just front-end performance with, JavaScript and ensuring that the browser doesn't become sluggish. This is actually in our back-end performance as well. And the reason why I like to say performance is a feature is it doesn't sound as negative. If you were to say the performance requirement, the performance constraint, trying to sell that to a stakeholder can often sound like, that's difficult or that's boring. But when you sell it as a feature, it can oftentimes help push that higher up the priority chain. And it helps you highlight the gains that will come out of improving your performance. The hard part about working with performance is it's hard to know where to start and where to stop because it is a very loose concept. The first thing that you need to do is come up with your constraints, but then assign business value. If the homepage is fast, like what's more valuable? Is the homepage being immediately fast or the catalog being faster? What's going to be higher on your priority? That way you can help assign these to like what you think will get you more conversions. So you could do actual research on what people consider to improve conversions on your business's website. And then the next step should be sprints for improving on the constraints. By working on performance in sprints, you're giving a fun boost to your developers' morale because for this week we're going to work on improving our performance, instead of just giving a task randomly throughout the week saying we'll try to figure out how to make this one thing faster. It gives it a concerted effort with multiple developers, which gives them a break from the other monotonous task of improve this feature, this bug. They get to dig their teeth into something interesting and different. And when you're doing those sprints, you again need to focus on the valuable gains. Trying to improve this one arbitrary API method may not make sense. You need to make sure that you're actually gaining performance where you've defined it to be valuable. And that will make these seem much more beneficial to your company as well. And also target what you can immediately control. I've even run into this. I start working on something, and then all of a sudden I found that an issue is kind of at the bottommost level. When working on a Drupal commerce site, there might be an issue in Drupal itself. It's going to be hard to change that bottom level. You can submit a patch, but you might not see an immediate gain out of that. But what you can do is investigate your integrations of the API. Okay, so at the bottom level there's this problem, but maybe it's actually my implementation of the API. So focus first at what you have direct control over and have created before diving down lower, and that will help you um, follow your path and your goal much easier. So let's tie this together with performance-driven development and Blackfire, how Blackfire can help you achieve these goals much easier. Because there are other ways that you could pull this off. But with my experience, Blackfire is the tool for implementing all of this. So for those who do not know, Blackfire is a software service performance management solution. And this helps you instead of you having to write a tool or use a tool like XHProf, which has no GUI, it allows you to quickly identify bottlenecks and where you're having performance issues without all of the lead up time to having to set up your own testing tool. And it helps you measure performance. Most tools just look at how long something is, but Blackfire has the philosophy that performance isn't just how long something took. There's disk input output, there's network input output, there's memory usage and CPU time. Most tools consider the last option to be the biggest, to be their one measurement is how long did it take the CPU to process this. And that doesn't really define performance, because what if you have a very REST API heavy application? You're going to worry more about your network I/O. Can you improve your backbone network so that way your e-commerce application can talk to your ERP faster? Are you reading feeds off your disk for importing your catalog? All of those are items that can be actually fixed without writing code, and most tools won't let you notice that. And then memory and CPU can be addressed by your actual code usage. And then there's the value of performance. Better performance can mean more conversions, and more conversions means more revenue. That's why you need to come up with the constraints. By saying that a product page should only load in 1 second, you can actually put a dollar amount to that, and you can find that dollar amount by researching what others have found. Such as Amazon, if they get their product pages to load like 100 milliseconds faster, it's some odd percentage a year in sales, and that odd percentage for them equates to millions, like hundreds of millions of dollars. So there is a huge value in performance in earning conversions, because if your site's slow, well, they'll go to somebody else who's fast. And conversions aren't just order sales. If you have a registration, like a site that just requires user registration and interaction, you want them to log in. Applications like Untapped and Foursquare would never have taken off if they were too slow and people couldn't sign up and actually use their service or were distracted by the slowness. And Google also takes your performance into its rankings as well. So let's compare Blackfire against XHProf and New Relic. So XHProf, again, is only against CPU time. It has no GUI or PHP 7 support. PHP 7, which I know plenty of projects are actually starting to switch over to PHP 7 already for the performance gains. And XHProf is always running. So it'll always be running in the back end every time that your application is going. That's where Blackfire is really interesting, because it is only triggered when you tell it to. By using some special HTTP headers, the profiler knows to run or to just not run. So this way it's not bogging down your performance. Your performance tool is not bogging down your performance. And then there's New Relic. I feel that most people are really familiar with New Relic as an application monitoring or application program monitor, or however APM stands for. New Relic provides constant monitoring, and it also monitors your entire stack. So it can keep eyes on your web server, your PHP FPM and what code's being used, and also your MySQL and what queries are being made. New Relic is great for insight, but it only provides a top level into your heavy performance items. It's not going to give you a fine grained breakdown. And with Blackfire, you get a more immediate insight as to what you are seeing with problems. One way I like to compare it is that Blackfire is for active profiling in any environment, whether it's production, QA, your dev, your local dev. You can immediately profile an item and see exactly what's going on in your stack trace and where bottlenecks might be happening. New Relic is passive in production monitoring. You're not really going to, most people don't have New Relic running on their QA or dev servers to monitor their performance there, only on their production. And that means that you're only going to catch performance regressions in production days after it's happened when it's finally caught them for you. And that doesn't really match into doing like a performance-driven development because you can't catch bugs before they happen, or you're going to have to pay a lot of money to have New Relic licenses on everybody's machine. So what's it all about? This is for Blackfire. It fixes where it matters. You're able to find out where the exact bottlenecks are and fix them right there. With Blackfire, you can have references as a baseline. So in a performance-driven development, at the end of a sprint, let's say you do a release at the end of the sprint, you run a profile and that becomes your new reference. So you have this baseline that at this point in time, our performance was here. And then every time that you run more tests and more profiles, you can use that baseline as a reference and see if you're gaining or losing performance. This is great because it will actually show you the difference in time on disk I/O, network I/O, CPU time. And Blackfire lets you profile all the things. Like you can profile your command line, you can profile HTTP. So if you have background tasks that are run on PHP scripts, such as importing products from your ERP or processing some kind of data, you can actually profile those CLI commands and make that performance faster too. So it's not just your HTTP request. It can be everything that you need. And with all this, Blackfire lets you deliver with performance. You can catch any performance regressions before delivering, just as you expect to do with your actual bugs and test coverage. So Blackfire supports continuous performance testing. And that's important if you're going to be developing with performance in mind, right? I don't think there's many projects that go out now without some kind of continuous integration that's running tests. So why not do that for performance as well? If you're going to try to catch bugs on every developer's commit or every feature branch merging and release, you should be doing this with performance as well. One way you can do that with Blackfire is by setting up environments. And one nice part about environments is instead of having to use each individual developer's API keys, each environment has its own specific APIs. And you can add multiple users to an environment, so you don't need to be tossing around API keys between each user. You set it up for the environment. If that user is part of that environment, they can view the results. And with environments, you can then match your development workflow. You don't want to have one environment for your production, QA, and dev, because then you're going to have all these profile results that are mixed together. So this way you can have one just for production, you can have one just for your QA environment, one for your dev, and understand and be able to quickly see the performance profiles for each environment there. And environments can also support periodic builds on top of your normal CI and CD. So you can configure it to test a certain URL at a specific interval, and it will actually run performance tests on those URLs. And you can also integrate with Logmatic, New Relic, and Platform. So if you use platform.sh, which is a very awesome platform as a service if you haven't tried it yet, when you push a commit and it rebuilds your environment, you could also trigger it to run a Blackfire build. And this is how you can have continuous integration with your performance testing along with your normal build cycle. And with your environment and how it runs that build is it actually is going to be running tests. Blackfire supports tests by adding a .blackfire.yaml to the root of your project. I want to specify here, when I say root of your project, it's actually your doc root. So whatever would be next to like index.php, if you have .blackfire.yaml, it will read this and then make these assertions. So right here in this example, I have product page should be really fast. And I give it the path of /product/1. And I'm putting some very basic assertions that the wall time, my CPU time, should be less than half a second. It should only use 10 megabytes of memory, and the network output should be under 50 kilobytes. So that way I'm ensuring that it has a tiny footprint. And actually that we should try to make that even smaller because that's still a huge size. And then here, one thing that is missing is there's a sample size. So this is assuming a cached page. And with Blackfire, you can actually tell it to sample a page multiple times. So in reality, when it's doing a CI integration, this page probably is not cached, so this would always fail. But what I would do is say sample it 10 times. So do this 10 times and take the median value and assert that. So that way you can assume that if the page was cached or there's a heavy load or it was completely cached, this is what that middle ground will be. So that's just the Blackfire YAML, but you probably already have tests written in PHP unit or whatever framework. So if you have the tests, you should now just seamlessly test your performance as well. Because you can run your Blackfire test via your code. There is a Blackfire SDK that you can easily integrate to your current application by using the Blackfire trait. And that allows you to easily configure a Blackfire client along with configuration. So here's that same example, or here with that Blackfire.yaml in my doc root, I'm going to actually trigger that page in my test. So I'm going to create a new configuration and set the title to be product page load, and I'm going to set my samples here to be 5. So that way it hits an uncached page once, then goes over it 4 more times cached. And I'm going to take my Guzzle client, which was injected with the Blackfire middleware, and point it to my product page. And then I'm going to retrieve the profile. And essentially, at the bottom, I'm going to assert that the profile was the profile would be if those assertions I previously defined pass. So now my tests are actually going to run the Blackfire tests without me having to use Blackfire's environment build. And then I can also have it output the profile URL so I can quickly go access it. So that's the big thing of doing performance-driven development, is you need to actually test your performance in your tests. Blackfire gives you 2 ways. You can have their environment builds randomly or periodically crawl your site against the tests that are in your Blackfire.yaml, or you can explicitly do it right here in your tests. And this is just for page load. You can actually test specific method calls. So you could assert in here that when I run this one operation, there should only be 10 MySQL queries. And that's all heavily documented in their documentation online. But I didn't pull that into the webinar because that's getting into the fine tune. Like what we should really be focusing on at first is this higher level. Is my page loading? Like how fast is this going? What are some of my resources that are being used? Because you need to define what is important to you when it comes to performance, right? If I tell you to develop with performance in mind, you kind of look like, well, what is performance? Like what do I need to actually test for? So the way that you can start doing that is your constraints should be measured in metrics, because you need them to be measurable so you know how to actually test for them. And one way to do that is, can you identify the source of a constraint? Like if I need the page to load in 1 second, what could be the factors of that? Is it just the wall time alone, or do I know that on my product page I'm going to be doing some REST calls, so I need to check my network I/O? Because that measurement is the performance of your metric, and then the constraint is the metric limit. Like how many times can this metric run to be part of my constraint? And with Blackfire, you can actually define your own metrics. So out of the box, Blackfire lets you test the metrics of wall time, network I/O, disk I/O, and there's even integrations with Magento, Doctrine, Symfony, Twig, such as like how many did twig compile at all? Technically, you probably don't want twig to compile at all when a page is loaded. But you're able to write your own integration metrics, such as in this case, I have one for the cache invalidation. Drupal has a cache tag system, and I wanted to assert that tags are never invalidated on a certain page, because that means like when the product page is being loaded, it should just be cache only. Nothing should be invalidated because nothing was changed. So this is allowed to be done in YAML, but at the same time, you can do it in PHP. You can define a metric by giving a name, and then with the equal sign, it's the class name, and then use the 2 colons, and then that's the method. And then Blackfire will actually check if that method pattern has been called at all during your profile, allows you to assert it. And here's an example of creating a custom metric. So with one client project, they decided that they needed the catalog to render in under a second. They were getting complaints from customers that the service was too slow. So that was the first thing to tackle. That had the highest business value to them, is to get this catalog to go under a second. So we added a Blackfire test. The performance was tested, and it was taking 2 seconds. All right, okay. Well, we knew it was failing, but now it's verified that it is failing. So we then reviewed the Blackfire profile and identified any bottlenecks that were happening. There were some extra loads that were happening that did not need to be. So then we wrote metrics to check that. I believe the case was that it was a very deep catalog, and they had a catalog menu that had 6 levels in it. So it was doing all these taxonomy term loads instead of Drupal. So we discovered that was the area, and the solution was caching the menu. So then we wrote a metric saying like taxonomy term load should only run 2 times instead of the 12 times it was running, or however. And we added those metrics, and then we put them into our test. And then we added the caching. That would be our solution to prevent those from running. And then we ran the test again. And this brought that catalog page from 2 seconds to, with caching, to about 100 milliseconds or something of that sort. Like with caching, we completely beat our expectations. And we're able to use Blackfire to assert that the cause of the problem was not happening again. So that's where writing the custom metrics help, because you can first test time, but then you need to look further on as to what's causing that time, and then asserting that you've beaten that problem and that it doesn't creep up again. And so with some closing remarks, I just wanted to bring up that you should start small and start simple, because you can easily just profile a page and just like, well, where are some performance issues I have? And spend half a day looking at the Blackfire call graph and having no idea where to start. So that's where you need to just find what you want to target, what your constraints are going to be, and then investigate. Because once you have those constraints figured out, just start documenting your performance via test. I want the product page to load in a second. Well, write a test for that. And if it's failing or not, if it's failing but you don't have the time to improve it right there, we'll just change your test to say that, okay, well, the product page is actually loading in like 1.7 seconds. Great, have it there, because now you know where you're having a performance problem. And then you can work on fixing that later on. So you're like, okay, well, what's violating our performance constraints? Since you already have it documented in your test, you can go back, and then based on what you've given the business value to with each constraint, you can then go and begin working on each of those items, now that you've identified where your actual bottlenecks are. So that's my webinar on performance-driven development and some of my thoughts on that. Thank you for attending.
All right. Well, thanks a lot, Matt. That was indeed really, really interesting. Was a cool example that made things probably even more tangible for everyone. Would be happy to take any questions. So you have the Zoom feature at the bottom of your screen, the Q&A, or the chat to ask them. So please feel free. So, yeah, about technical issues and recording, yes, we are recording, so you will get that just the time to edit it a little, and we'll post it on YouTube. I believe that Matt has actually submitted a session at DrupalCon Dublin about performance-driven development. Is that right, Matt?
Yes, I did submit a session for DrupalCon Dublin. I have not heard back yet on the status of that, so I will be, if it is accepted, I will be mentioning it on my Twitter, or just keep an eye out for DrupalCon Dublin. And I do plan on trying to find a few other conferences to present this at. And also working on a fully working example of what this kind of workflow would look like by having a GitHub repo that is integrated with Travis or even platform.sh that then executes Blackfire tests. So that way there's a boilerplate that people could see and begin working with. Because this will make you, by working on performance, you will make more money in the long run, especially in highly volatile areas where if the page loads too slow, like you lose a conversion, and that conversion could be $100. So I plan on really pushing this forward and having some good examples on how this can work.
Great. Looking forward to it. Any more questions? Oh, yes. Here is one. So I'm just going to read it for everybody. What is your opinion on implementing performance-driven development in our workflow? Should we implement it from start at each level, or just make sure that we cross the line on important features?
Right. So I think you should just start out on each level, or actually, it depends on what's valuable to you. Is it going to be, because it takes time, right? It takes time to write tests, which is one reason that tests often get lowered in their priority. But if it's most valuable for you to only start on important features, then yeah, because if those important features are what are going to is what the business has put highest value to, like at least fight to start there, because you might not get funding from the stakeholders or from the project owner to, write performance tests for everything. But if you can at least say, like, well, if we're already writing tests for these big features that we're rolling out in the sprint, like, let's test our performance too. Because what good is it to roll out a big shiny feature? They want the feature to roll out and work. Well, just because it works doesn't mean people are going to use it. And performance is going to be the answer to that. If it's performant and bug-free, it's probably going to be used. So that you have to know your project stakeholders and owners, how you can integrate that. But that's always my argument. You want the feature to be bug-free so that way people use it, but you also want it to be performant because a slow feature isn't really going to get that much attention.
Okay, thanks for the answer. So there's two more questions. I'll take next one. So the question is, I have worked with Blackfire on my local machines. Does Blackfire provide some more integration with multiple AWS servers under auto-scaling and registered under an ELB? Well, actually, I'm not familiar with all of those features here, but the point being that you can install Blackfire on whichever servers you like. We also do have some partnerships and integrations with specific hosters. So, basically, as soon as you can configure your machine, you can simply install the Blackfire components there and start profiling. Then the environments feature that Matt has described during the webinar will make it easier to get started with performance tests and differentiating them depending on the app or the development stage of your app, meaning staging, development, or production.
I'll take the next one. So the question is, if we've identified any patterns in Drupal where the performance degrades using this tool. No, not like if you have, so take XHProf or like even Xdebug, for example. Those are always on and running and are technically slowing down PHP whenever it runs. Blackfire, it will listen for a specific HTTP header and turn itself on. So if in that request there's no header, it doesn't run, which means that it's not affecting your PHP instance at all. So I haven't noticed any issues with performance degradation using this tool, which is one reason I've liked it, because it only runs when you need it to. It's not always on and listening and then hogging up CPU time as well. And then the next question, how does this help in monitoring single page apps as in JS? Because that's the de facto standard. Well, Blackfire is a PHP profiling tool. So if your single page app is in JS, I'm assuming it's going to be talking to a backend somewhere. So your backend needs to be performant as well. For JS, I could be wrong here, but I don't believe Blackfire really has a way to test the JavaScript endpoint because there are so many tools. I mean, shoot, Chrome's Dev Tools provides a huge way to test your JS performance. But if you're still talking to a backend somewhere, so you could still profile your AJAX requests and any form submissions and see what's, is the problem our front end or is the problem our back end? So this tool could still be used even if you have a decoupled application.
That's right. Thank you, Matt. Actually, I'll take the next one, which is, does Blackfire.io does it have a hourly pricing? No, it doesn't. It's either monthly or yearly. But if you like, I can pick that question with you after the webinar to give you more details about how the pricing works.
Yeah, so you can profile API endpoints that are, so for example, you can actually simulate post requests as well, using the Blackfire.yaml or in your code. If it's a simple API endpoint, just do it in the YAML file. But if it's a more robust one, the SDK has integrations with Guzzle, the Gout WebDriver. Actually, there's a whole bunch of integrations you can do with the SDK. So if you have PHP unit, which is like in my test example, I would drop the middleware into Guzzle and then look up the Gout integration and then see, well, actually you won't need Gout if it's an API endpoint. But I would inject the Blackfire middleware into Guzzle and then run the request and then take the profile results and do your assertions from there. So that's actually one of my next steps is to start working on, we actually have a client that's going to need more profiling other API endpoints. All right, so this question is, D8 now has its own profiling. Please advise the difference between Blackfire and the Devil profile. Well, the development module, Devil, has a web profiler, but that's not really profiling your PHP code. That's profiling Drupal. And that's a profiler that's inside of Drupal. So that's like profiling with XHProf. Not the same, but it's always running. So XHProf could possibly adjust some of your wall time, just as the web profiler is going to adjust inside of Drupal. It's not giving you a good bystander, like a bystander looking over how things are running. The web profiler shipped with the Devil module is like in the middle of it looking out, where I would consider Blackfire is standing to the side looking up and down, if that helps. I'm sure the web profile one-offs, I know I've seen it. I haven't actually tried it yet. But it's not going to give you the same results as using Blackfire, especially if you do want to start integrating performance in your tests. Actually, Christoph, could you possibly help me with the next one?
Okay, I just need to make sure I understand it properly. Are you talking about microservices and such use cases? Okay, well, I will assume that's the case. So, what happens indeed when, what happens then when a request is calling for another request, and is it possible then to display that in a single profile? At this point, no, it isn't. That's mainly for a matter of how we build our security. But this is something that we're working on, and the point will most likely be to display that within a build. So it's not going to be a single profile containing all of the requests. It's going to be a build that will contain the list of profiles for all of the requests. Okay. Yeah. So then, thanks a lot, everyone. Special thanks, of course, to Matt Glaman for doing this webinar. Again, that was really interesting. Thanks a lot for taking the time to do that and to answer all the questions. Yeah, looking forward to meet with you most likely at DrupalCon.
Yeah, same to you. Thanks for having me.
All right. Have a good day, everybody.